Hayakum Allah. Just min bab faida, inshaAllah. So, who can read this? This is a book of tafsir here, 22 volumes. Right? 22 volumes. Jayid al-Qurtubi. Imam al-Qurtubi. Qurtuba was where? Where's Qurtuba? Imam Qurtubi, so he's from the place called Qurtuba. Where's Qurtuba? Spain, right? Cordoba. Qurtuba was the capital of Muslim Andalus. Muslims ruled Muslim Spain, which is larger than just Spain today. That includes Portugal, etc., for over 800 years. Over 800 years, subhanAllah, right? In South Africa, Islam is not maybe 350, 400 years old. In Spain, for over 800 years, subhanAllah. And Qurtuba itself, which was the capital of the Umayyads in Spain, the Muslims ruled it for over 500 years. Over 500 years. The main masjid of Qurtuba that if anybody visits, you go to see it, that has been transformed. In the middle of it, they put a cathedral. The grand mosque of Qurtuba, massive masjid, mashallah. You know Medina, how many of you been to Medina? Nobody? One. Jayid. The styling of the arches in the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ, you have the colors in the arch, Jayid, that was taken from masjid of Qurtuba. So Imam al-Qurtubi, he was from Cordoba, Jayid. He was born around between 600 and 610, and he passed away around 670, right? Around 670, and he put together this tafsir here, tafsir of Imam al-Qurtubi. In fact, Cordoba had hundreds and thousands of scholars, but when anyone says Imam of Qurtuba, it's only this scholar that it goes back to. There were many imams in Qurtuba, but when somebody says Imam al-Qurtubi, it goes back to this scholar here, right? Imam Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Ansari al-Qurtubi, insha'Allah. And his tafsir, you have different types of tafsir. His tafsir falls in the category of Ahkam al-Quran. Imam al-Shafi'i, for example, here you have Ahkam al-Quran of Imam al-Shafi'i, Ahkam al-Quran of Jassas, Ahkam al-Quran of Imam al-Tahawi, Ahkam al-Quran of Ibn al-Arabi, etc. Ahkam al-Quran type of tafsir focuses on the fiqh explanation of the verses of Quran. Are you with us? So you have Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian scholar. He's got a tafsir of the Quran which is more related to like a political reading of the Quran, right? Depending where the mufassir is coming from. Somebody else will have a tafsir of the Quran focusing more on tarbiyah matters. Somebody else will have a tafsir of Quran focusing more on aqidah matters. This tafsir here is focusing more on the fiqh rulings related to the different verses, right? But his tafsir is more than, for example, somebody says, mashallah, I read a tafsir. This one volume here is tafsir of ahkam of the Quran. And then you got this 20 volumes on the same thing. Somebody might write 3 lines on that verse and somebody else writes 30 pages on that verse, right? So the depth with regards to it, inshaAllah. Imam al-Qurtubi, his tafsir is rather murattab and in order. So he would go across the verses and say that this verse, we will be pulling out 20 masail. Then he'll talk about the language, and then he'll talk about the fiqh, and the Hanafi say this and the Shafi'i say that, etc., etc. And the scholars of Andalus, which fiqh madhab would they generally follow? No, not Shafi'i. Scholars of Andalus, they generally followed which madhab? The Maliki madhab, right? North Africa, because from North Africa, etc., then they went to Muslim Spain, and so North Africans, the people in Mali, people in Mauritania, people in Libya, they generally follow the Maliki madhab. Morocco, generally the Maliki madhab, right? So he was Maliki in his fiqh, inshallah. And some pointers with regards to his tafsir, inshallah. We mentioned that one volume there, the Ahkam of Quran by Imam al-Shafi'i. Imam al-Shafi'i didn't put together a book on the tafsir of Ahkam of Quran, but one of his students, Imam al-Bayhaqi, took Imam al-Shafi'i's books, Kitab al-Umm, etc., and pulled out all of those places where Imam al-Shafi'i spoke about certain verses of the Quran related to fiqh. Right? So for example, verses of tayammum, verses of salah, verses of marriage, etc. Wherever Imam Shafi'i spoke about that, then Imam al-Bayhaqi pulled it out and put it together in this one volume. Imam Jassas, so from a Hanafi point of view, he has a ahkam of the Quran, but more leaning towards the Hanafi side. If he's talking about wudu and salah and tayammum, etc., he's giving more the Hanafi side of matters, and maybe even mentioning the others, but no, the Hanafi opinion is the strongest, etc., etc. Imam al-Qurtubi, he was rather balanced. So he's Maliki, yes, but his idea behind the tafsir, mention others, and the Hanafis say that, the Malikis say that, and he's not trying to push down the Maliki opinion down people's throats and try to prove that it is the correct opinion, etc., etc. Jade. So he was rather balanced, inshallah. Then there was a Shafi'i scholar, Ilkiya at-Tabari al-Rasi. He's got a Shafi'i version of the ahkam of the Quran. Imam Ibn al-Arabi. Ibn al-Arabi, the Maliki scholar, he's got a Maliki ahkam of the Quran. And subhanallah, one of the contemporary scholars, Sheikh Abdul Karim al-Khudair, he went through this whole 20 something volumes in like a weekly lesson, or every 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It took him about 20 years, right? About 20 years. You know, I mean, if Ramadan comes, then you have a holiday. Then Hajj time comes, then you have a holiday. But he had this continuous lesson going through the tafsir of Imam al-Qurtubi at a masjid. And across that 23 years or 25 years, right, there was only one student that was there from the beginning until the end. Right? Only one. Right? Others came and others went, etc., etc. But one student was there from the beginning until the end, subhanallah. Right? Imam al-Qurtubi, he was a zahid. He was somebody away from the matters of this dunya, etc. Yes, he was there in Qurtuba, which at one time was the capital of Muslim Spain. But then in the year 633, eventually Qurtuba fell. Right? So Qurtuba was under Muslim control for 520 something years. And then eventually fell. Muslims started infighting and this and that. And they were taken over, and that's when he left. In around 633, he left. And eventually he goes to Egypt, and he settles in Egypt. And so he wrote his tafsir in Egypt, but not in Andalus. He was an expert in tafsir, etc. He was a zahid. Many talk about his explanation of the surah Al-Hakum al-Takathur. Al-Hakum al-Takathur is talking about what? Hatta zurtumul maqabir, that you want to collect money of the dunya, and you'll continue to do this until you go and visit the grave. It means until you visit the grave and you get a reminder, or until you die and then you are in the grave, right? Because when we are in the grave, technically it's a visit, because that's not our final destination, right? And so there he talks a lot about the matters of the dunya, etc., etc. There's a famous clip of Sheikh Yasir ad-Dosari, who's the Imam of the Haram, and he talks about Imam al-Qurtubi's introduction, and he begins to like cry. He says that glad tidings to the person who spends their life learning and teaching and studying the Quran. And then he says, as Imam al-Qurtubi said, because this is the chosen book, and because this is the kalam of Allah, and because Allah sent it with the Amin of Sama, Amin of the Sama, the trustworthy one of the sky, Jibril, to the Amin of the Ard. Who is the Amin of the Ard? The Amin on earth? Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Allah's final book was sent by the Amin of the Sama to the Amin of the earth to pass on to mankind as guidance, etc. And so Imam al-Qurtubi says, because it has such a manzil and has such a high stage, that's why he decided to spend his life and focus on the Quran, etc. Right? Imam al-Qurtubi, yes, he was Ash'ari in many of the interpretations related to Asma wa Sifat, etc., etc. In this encyclopedia, it's an encyclopedia, he mentions about 10,000 ahadith, right? 10,000 ahadith, while talking here, this hadith about that hadith about that, etc. Amongst them, the good, the bad, and the ugly, some weak ahadith, some fabricated ahadith, etc. Hadith studies was not his forte, he was not an expert in that matter there, inshallah, right? Imam al-Qurtubi, this book of his, from all the books related to ahkam of the Quran. Like for example, we mentioned Imam al-Shafi'i, Imam al-Bayhaqi pulled out there, then Jassas has a Hanafi type of ahkam of Quran. Then we have Rawa'i'ul Bayan by by Sheikh Muhammad Sabuni, 2 volumes. This is a contemporary scholar, Syrian scholar. He passed away a few years ago. He even visited South Africa. We met him in Cape Town. Then Ali Sayis, he's got 2 volumes. Sheikh Abdulaziz At-Turifi, who's in jail, he's got 5 volumes. But now those type of tafsirs are related to ahkam. 2 volumes, 3 volumes, 4 or 5 volumes. But Imam al-Qurtubi, look here, 20 something volumes. So it's the most ashmal, it's the most comprehensive from all of those different ones. Ibn Kathir, you hear about Ibn Kathir's tafsir here, 8 volumes. Ibn Kathir, when he came along and he's writing his tafsir, he benefited from Imam al-Qurtubi's tafsir, insha'Allah. So everyone who came after him, they benefited from his tafsir. Imam al-Shawkani of Yemen also benefited from that. And there's many summaries available. You can go to a marketplace, bookshop, Imam al-Qurtubi's 1 volume summary. You've seen Dar es-Salam has 10 volumes, Tafsir Ibn Kathir. Have you seen that? Right? In English, Tafsir Ibn Kathir in 10 volumes. But what is that? That's not the English translation of these 8 volumes. No. Sheikh Safiur Rahman Mubarak Puri, who wrote Rahiq al-Makhtoum, the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he took this Tafsir Ibn Kathir and he summarized it in 1 volume. And then they took that 1 volume and they translated it into English in 10 volumes. Right? Did you get that? Yeah. Right? So when you go into the bookshop, mashallah, somebody says, mashallah, I bought Tafsir Ibn Kathir in English. No, what you're buying is the summary of Tafsir Ibn Kathir. That summary, it's in 1 thick Arabic volume, but then when you translated it into English, it came into 10 volumes. But the full Tafsir Ibn Kathir has not been translated, right? And many books were written on the methodology of Imam al-Qurtubi, his style and his methodology, etc., etc. And the introduction of the book is very important and very good. He talks about the virtue of studying the Quran and memorizing the Quran, etc., etc. During his time, the Muslims of Spain, they went through different dynasties. You had the Umayyads of Spain. They came and they went. Then you also had the Murabitun of Spain. They came and they went. Then you had the Muwahhidun. And the Muwahhidun were the last to fall. Qurtuba was under their control when it eventually fell. Imam al-Qurtubi also, he died when I think Ibn Taymiyyah, around the time of Ibn Taymiyyah, so he died, and I think about 10 years later, Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, he was born, it was exactly 10 years after Ibn Taymiyyah was born, he died. And 10 years later, Ibn Taymiyyah was born. Why that's important? Because somebody mentions and he says that Ibn Taymiyyah's student was a certain Qurtubi. No, that's another Qurtubi and not Imam al-Qurtubi. Imam al-Qurtubi died 10 years later. Imagine what a mistake, you big sheikh, etc. And you say that Ibn Taymiyyah's student, Imam al-Qurtubi. No, sheikh, that's another Qurtubi. Imam al-Qurtubi died and Ibn Taymiyyah was not even born. He was born only 10 years later. And he died in Egypt, and he died around the year 670, inshallah. Rahimahullah, Imam al-Qurtubi. Barakallah feek.